So I switched to English, and I'm delighted to introduce Sheila Jeffreys to you. Sheila is an academic and activist. She joined her first women's liberation movement group in London in 1973 and was then active in campaigning against pornography and sexual violence and in lesbian feminism. She moved to Australia in 1991 to teach feminist politics at the University of Melbourne, where she set up the Australian branch of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. She retired back to the UK in 2015, where she is involved in the Women's Human Rights Campaign and is writing another book on male sexuality. She's the author of 10 books on the history and politics of sexuality, most recently her autobiography, Trigger Warning, My Lesbian Feminist Life, which was published last month. So, we're happy to have you here, Sheila. Over to you now.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Hello, sisters. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm going to talk about the importance of challenging all forms of men's cross-dressing behavior, both political and cultural. The imitation of members of an oppressed class of persons, women, by members of the oppressor class, men, whether for sexual excitement or entertainment, is harmful to us. I will talk about defeating the campaign by transvestites, i.e. heterosexual men who sexually fetishize women's subordination by imitating women's appearance and seek to enshrine what they call gender identity in law. But I will also talk about the problem of drag, i.e. cross-dressing behavior by gay men, and why it's important that those who are campaigning against men's gender identity rights also challenge this gay male practice. The campaign for gender identity rights violates women's human rights by gaining access by men to all women's spaces and opportunities and erasing women. Drag is different in its effects. It is also based upon imitating women, in this case ridiculing women for entertainment, and is being normalized in a way which makes this form of woman-hating central to mainstream culture. I am one of the authors of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which was launched in 2019. The Declaration is a response to a men's rights movement, which was set up by men who are transvestites. Transvestism, according to the DSM, the American Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, consists of men's sexual practice of dressing in women's clothes and body parts, and imitating exaggerated forms of femininity for masochistic sexual excitement. In recent decades, the transvestite activists have developed a new and more respectable name for themselves, transgender, and claim that a man should become a woman. These men are hell-bent on hiding their sexual motivations. They claim that their problem is one of biology. They just somehow have an essence of womanhood, which they call gender identity, in their completely male bodies. The research shows that many people, particularly surprisingly those on the left side of politics, will support a group of people and their practice if they consider it to be based in biology rather than choice or environment. For this reason, it is very important that we are clear that men can neither change sex nor be possessed of an essence of womanhood. The Declaration is a response to the fact that in countries all over the world, transvestites are gaining legal rights to destroy all that women have won over decades of campaigning for our human rights. We wrote it to remind women of what our rights as women are in United Nations conventions, and specifically CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We showed how men who claim to have gender identities that entitle them to pretend to be women in women's spaces, prisons, toilets, shelters, in politics and in policy, threaten women's rights. It had become clear that transgender activists had achieved policy capture. Governments and legislatures were serving men and promoting their desires with no concern for or consultation with women. The men's rights movement began in the late 1990s. In the women's liberation movement in the UK in the 1970s and 1980s, which I was involved in, we had a bit of trouble from men who dressed up as women and demanded entry to women's events. But there were only one or two of them, and we were united in our rejection of their efforts. Both in the UK and in the US, the majority of feminists were angry that men behaved like this, and certainly did not see them as women. We saw these men as making a mockery of women. Lesbians at that time were not transgendering. The trend towards some lesbians choosing to transition did not begin until the 1990s. There were two kinds of men who cross-dressed. The minority were men who felt that they must be women because they were attracted to other men and too self-hating to love men as men. The majority were heterosexual men who gained masochistic sexual excitement from luxuriating in women's oppression. In the 1970s and 1980s, transvestites began to organize themselves into support groups. And in the 1990s, these support groups became the nucleus of a men's rights movement. The development of the pornography industry stimulated these men and increased their confidence and numbers. The internet enabled them to network. The increased confidence led to them claiming to actually be women, which transvestites generally did not do before this time. Some transvestites began a campaign to gain what they called gender identity rights or transgender rights. They said that they had gender identities which made them really women, and they drew up a variety of demands which they called rights, which included being able to self-define what they called their gender and express their gender identities, meaning to imitate women in public and wherever they wished. What is now called gender is what we used to call sex role stereotyping. We understood this stereotyping to be fundamental to the oppression of women. Indeed, in 1979, the Women's Convention, the Convention on all forms of on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, stated the government should seek to eliminate sex role stereotypes because they were the basis of the oppression of women. Unfortunately, precisely the stereotypes that made women subordinate, oppressive and painful beauty practices like high-heeled shoes were those that excited male masochists, and they fought to retain them. When this men's rights movement got underway in the 1990s, feminists did not know what was happening. I was writing about transsexuals at this time and about the new problem of some lesbians having hormones and surgery to simulate men. But I did not know that the men were organizing legally or becoming a force to be reckoned with. In the early 2000s, some of these men began to organize to change the laws in their own countries and internationally. In the UK, the result of their efforts was the 2004 Gender Recognition Act. This act created a process by which people could change what was called their gender, which was not defined. They had to come before a gender recognition panel, have the support of 2 doctors, have lived in their preferred gender for 2 years, and get a certificate which was used to show that they had changed sex, or gender, as it was called. This meant that the sex stereotypes which feminists were determined to abolish had been written into law. Men who dressed as porn stars or teetered about in high heels and makeup were seen as what women are. I was living in Australia at this time and did not know about the Act until it had gone through. UK feminists were not consulted or aware of this legislation. The transvestites, having achieved so much success, went on to ratchet up their demands. Now they wanted to make it easier for men to get legal status as women by making it possible to self-identify, i.e. a man could just say he was a woman and get all his documents changed with no need for a diagnosis or any process of assessment. I became more and more concerned and started to write about the new UK law and about the terrible harms of transgendering children, which started to develop in Australia and the UK at this time. This was a very low point in the history of feminism. The women's liberation movement and all that it created had disappeared. There was nothing to replace it. For this reason, it was very hard to get women to be concerned about the politics of transgenderism. In a time in which the women's liberation movement was strong, in which feminism was strong, it would not have been possible for men to have these successes. I wrote my book, Gender Hurts, a feminist analysis of the politics of transgenderism, to show what was happening and help to create a resistance movement, and that was published in 2014. I know that in many countries the situation seems very bad. Governments have already created laws to allow men to self-identify as women without any need for doctors, but just on a whim, or they intend to do so. But things are changing. The complete dominance of transgender ideology in the media and politics has been seriously undermined in the UK, where I retired back to in 2015. A strong feminist movement has been created over the last few years in response to the UK government wanting to bring in self-identification legislation. It was a fierce struggle. It has been a very difficult time, but it's been the catalyst for creating a new wave of feminism. This is not the result that the transgender activists, who are mostly just ordinary misogynists and men's rights activists, wanted. They overreached themselves. Feminist organising against this men's movement in the UK has had considerable success. It has led to the UK government announcing it will not introduce the legislation it intended to put forward on self-identification. Scotland, though, which has independent jurisdiction over such matters, is still intent on going down this path, though there is fierce feminist resistance there, including from some women MPs. Many positive changes are taking place in the UK around the transgendering of children. There was an important legal case taking place on behalf of a young lesbian detransitioner and a mother against the Tavistock Clinic, which carries out this form of violence. The UK government has changed its guidance for schools. This is very important because schools were teaching children that they could be born in the wrong body, and they're no longer allowed to do so. The guidance states, you should not reinforce harmful stereotypes. For instance, by suggesting that children might be a different gender based on their personality and interests or the clothes they prefer to wear. Instead, schools are required to teach that sex role stereotyping is wrong and that boys and girls may play with whatever toys they like and wear whatever clothes they like without being told they're actually transgender. Many more people are speaking out, like the Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling, because there are so many, women are becoming less afraid, and this makes them speak out too. There is a very changed atmosphere. I say this to bring a little optimism to what is a very hard struggle. There is still, though, much to be done, particularly in relation to the way that the practice of men's cross-dressing has permeated male-stream culture. I want to talk today about gay male cross-dressing, usually called drag, which should be included in the feminist struggle against the rights of male cross-dressers to imitate women. At the same time as transvestites, men with the sexual paraphilia of being sexually excited by women's subordination, were campaigning so successfully for their rights to imitate women in law and public, gay male drag artists were normalizing their practice. In the 1960s and 70s, gay men did drag performances in a few pubs, mainly for other gay men. It was an underground culture of woman-hating. Nowadays, men in drag have become staples of popular entertainment, and drag has become extremely significant in popular culture. Today, the hit show RuPaul's Drag Race, which started in 2010, in which men dress up as women to compete for prizes, has a number of spin-offs, and 2 collections of academic articles simply on this show have already been published. There are many similar shows that have been commissioned as a result of its success. The expression of hatred towards women in drag performances is routine. A good example is the fact that the word fishy is thrown around. Fish is a word from the woman hatred of gay male culture and refers to women according to the supposed smell of women's genitals. The framework for judging the show is composed of a 4-letter word, which is insulting precisely because it refers to women's genitals. C for charisma, U for uniqueness, N for nerve, and T for talent, i.e. C-U-N-T. I always spell this word out rather than saying it because it is such a terrible word in the way it's used against women. The most significant evidence that drag has become mainstream is the existence of Drag Queen Story Hour. In Drag Queen Story Hours, drag queens read books to toddlers at libraries, museums, and galleries under the banner of teaching children about diversity. This is a recent development. In the UK, it originated in Bristol, where it was set up for Bristol Pride in 2017. And it was modelled on the Drag Queen Storytime in California. The propaganda of Drag Queen Storytime is that it teaches diversity. The US Drag Queen Storytime website proclaims, Drag Queen Storytime captures the imagination and play of the gender fluidity of childhood and gives kids glamorous, positive, and unabashedly queer role models. Other aspects of diversity seem to be neglected. Lesbians and gay men who do not cross-dress have not been invited to read to children. It would be interesting to know whether this is happening in Germany too, or whether it is confined to the Anglosphere. And in fact, Stephanie has already said to me that it's starting to happen in Berlin. Drag queen performances are not about positive role models for children. They are sexual performances in which the gay male practitioners gyrate and twerk and display their crotches. Drag queens are often involved in gay male prostitution, and the acts promote their services. Drag queen names regularly reference the sex industry. The featured drag queen who performed for toddlers in schools in Bristol in 2017 calls himself Miss Beaver, a term used in the culture of pornography to mean women's genitals. The online slang dictionary defines a beaver shot thus: a pornographic photograph graphically displaying the beaver, i.e. external female genitalia. Many of the names adopted by drag queens indicate the cultural values of prostitution, male gay sexual practice, and the hatred of women and women's bodies. One list of the funniest drag queen names on the US Pride website includes the following: Anna Borschen, A Very Good Lay, Molestia Child, Phallic Cunt, Lucy Stool, and Olive D. Cox. There is no evidence that Molestia Child has been involved in Drag Queen Story Hour, but the very existence of this in a list of funny drag queen names suggests a drag queen culture that is hostile to children and at least permissive about child sexual abuse. The public authorities who invite drag queens to speak to children may be unfamiliar with the origins and values of drag culture. There was considerable controversy over the decision early in 2020 to invite a drag queen, along with the lesbian Scottish National Party MP, Mhairi Black, to visit a primary school in Scotland in honour of Lesbian and Gay History Month. The local council said it had been unaware that the drag queen had sexually explicit material on his social media profiles. But his name, Flowjob, which refers to a sexual service of fellatio called a blowjob, should surely have provided a clue. Apparently, however, he was introduced simply as Flo. The head teacher said that the children were keen to hear from members of the LGBT community. On top of the list was to invite a drag queen into school to talk about her experiences growing up and her job. Concern was raised after Flowjob's social media profile was discovered subsequent to the event. Mary Black said those who complained were guilty of homophobia. One offshoot of the normalization of drag is the phenomenon of drag kids. Drag kids are children who are inducted into drag performances at drag queen competitions and in clubs and drag venues. The most well-known is Desmond Napoli's, whose drag queen name is Desmond is Amazing. The child was inducted into drag by his mother, who said she observed him being interested in watching RuPaul's Drag Race on television when he was 2 years old. From that point onward, she trained him to be a drag queen. By the age of 8, he was voguing throughout a gay pride parade. He was taken up by drag queens and now dances professionally at gay pride events and clubs. As a celebrity, he or his parents make money from the endorsement of products and tips at his performances. Video of him dancing in a gay bar at age 11 in 2018 and being tipped by the adult gay men in the audience caused some controversy. Gradually, more drag kids are being discovered in talent shows and exhibited in clubs and competitions and on television shows. The practice of drag mocks and degrades women in the same way as dressing up in blackface mocks and degrades Black people. Blackface, though, is usually universally condemned as a politically incorrect practice in a way that womanface is not. White people in blackface would not be acceptable in any publicly provided settings or performing for children. The similarities are considerable. The British Broadcasting Corporation's website for children contains a definition of blackface which is useful. It says that blackface is a largely historical practice which is seen as racist and many people find it deeply offensive. Blackface was a practice in which Black people were mocked for the entertainment of white people, and negative stereotypes were promoted across the US and Europe. White people doing blackface, we are told, would do insulting impressions of Black people in very exaggerated ways, for example, mocking their accent. In the case of drag, the accent which is adopted is camp, a feminized form of speech, which is historically central to gay male culture and persists, particularly in drag. Unfortunately, drag cannot be said to be historical, as blackface is, because it is still in the process of being disseminated across popular culture and education in Western countries. The work of feminist campaigners against the cultural woman hatred that is the basis of men's cross-dressing practice will not be complete until womanface becomes as politically unacceptable as blackface. The struggle against the encroachment of transvestites upon our rights and opportunities, and the injection of the poison of woman hating into our cultural life through drag is hard, but it is underway. These Women's Human Rights Campaign webinars are uniting women from across the world. A new women's liberation movement is growing, and I am delighted to meet the feminists who are making this happen in Germany at this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. That was a very insightful and very inspiring talk, as always. So the participants are invited to ask questions to Sheila now, and I will start with a noun question, which is, there is a German, something like a Gender Recognition Act since 1980 already. And because of decisions made by the Federal Constitutional Court, the Bundesverfassungsgericht, it is about to be updated now. So what are your recommendations to the German government concerning this?
Well, I had a quick look to see what that legislation was. And of course, because it was from 40 years ago, it doesn't use the term gender, and it talks about transsexualism. And the piece of that act, which allows men to change their sex on legal documents and so on, the bit of the act that the court said was unacceptable was that it requires men to have surgery to remove their genitals. And that, of course, is a very terrible thing. And states should not be able to do such things. They cannot require the mutilation of any person. However, the basic problem is that that act ever existed in 1980, which is very early for this sort of legislation, which allowed men to change their sex anyway. So in terms of what's being suggested now, it does seem to be simply that requirement that the genitals be removed taken out of that legislation. And indeed, in the British Act from 2004, there is no requirement that men have to have their genitals removed. The thing to watch, I think, for German feminists is whether anything is added to this. They need to look at the language and whether gender identity is going to be put into this act, whether self-identification is going to be put in so that men can just say that they're women without having to do anything, without a diagnosis, without living 2 years, doing the real life test, and so on and so on. Now, I don't know what's being proposed around all of that. I think the problem that we have is that we must not just fight self-identification, but we have to fight these original forms of legislation which say that it's possible, and this is an absurdity in law, which say that it is possible for men to become women. It's much clearer why there's a very serious problem here, because in this country, the question has been about gender identity and very clearly simply about sex stereotypes. Your old legislation is about something called transsexualism. And there are a lot of people who think transsexualism is somehow different, that might be about some genuine gender dysphoria that someone has in their heads, whereas a lot of the men these days are just transvestites who are just dressing up in the clothing. But in fact, of course, it all comes from the same source, and the transsexuals are the ones who have fought for and created the men's rights movement. They would have been called transsexuals once upon a time. But the language of transgenderism was adopted and the whole concept became much broader. So I don't know what I can say really, because I'm not sure exactly what's being proposed here. So
it's okay. Just for as an information, the requirement to be mutilated is not there anymore. It's just the government, actually, they want to get rid of this transsexual law, and they want to establish a self-ID law. That's no, that's not the plan of the government, but of the opposition. The opposition wants it.
So in fact, the law has already been changed.
No, there's still a transsexualism law, and the opposition says they want to get rid of it, but make a new self-ID law.
Okay, but the court has not required that. The court only required the removal of the mutilation.
Yeah, the court says the transsexual law has some fault things in it, and it has to be updated at least. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So absolutely, you need to be fighting.
Yeah.
Gender self-ID. There is no question.
Yeah.
You started.
We did. Yeah. And another question would be, what do you think, why has transgenderism become so influential at this point of history?
Well, as I said a little bit in my talk, the transvestites have been around for a long time. I mean, the early sexological writings in the first part of the 20th century had case histories about transvestites, men who were sexually excited by wearing women's clothes. And it was seen as a paraphilia, a sexual paraphilia. What's happened in recent years is in the 1960s, 1970s, a lot of men who were involved in various forms of sexual paraphilia started to create support groups for themselves. For instance, in the 1970s, nappy fetishists, men who like to wear nappies and pretend to be babies and so on. There was a support organization set up in late 60s, early 1970s. As a result of the sort of sexual revolution, all of these forms of men's sexual interest started to develop and they formed organizations for themselves. But it wasn't really until the 1990s that the whole development of pornography, which has of course created a huge wave of interest by men in engaging in this practice and many, many other paraphilias, really gave a boost to these men, and it enabled them to organize because the internet enabled them to organize in groups where they could discuss their pornography and their interests and so on. So that's really what created this movement in the 1990s. And that's why it's happening at this time. I think, as I said in my talk, the reason that feminists never challenged any of this, partly I think it was because feminists have not looked at male sexuality. They haven't looked at what men were doing. They have concentrated on protecting women and not examined what men were doing. But also there was a very, very low point for feminism in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. There was very little feminism around. So women were not fighting what was happening. I think we just did not see it coming. I did see it coming fairly early, but most women had no idea. I suspect that most feminists had no idea at the time that the 2004 legislation was happening in the UK. I suspect they didn't know, which is, I know, kind of shocking, because now we do know and now we are looking. Women don't know what men's pornography is. They don't see it usually. They don't know what men's sexual practices are. And I think there are probably still a lot of women who actually think that, you know, there are these men, these poor men who have this gender dysphoria, who need our sympathy, and that it's nothing to do with sex. I think there's a lot of women probably who still think that, even though we are working very hard to actually show what's going on.
Yeah. And do you think that men who claim to be women think they are women by themselves?
What do you mean?
If they're, you know, the men who pretend to be women, do you think they really think they are women, or do they just say they are women, you know?
Oh, very, very good question. I think that the vast majority of those who created this movement, of course, absolutely don't think they're women. They know who they are. They know what they're sexually excited by. But of course, they have these problems such as that they wanted to be able to get treatment on national health systems. So they couldn't just say, we're transvestites, we're fetishists, you need to give us hormones, possible facial surgery, or whatever it is that they wanted. So they had to make up some picture of themselves as a special kind of person. And of course, in order to be able to go into women's toilets and get the erections from pretending to be women in there and so on, they had to be able to say that they needed the rights of gender expression and so on. So yes, they've created an extraordinary ideology, which I'm sure the vast majority know is absolutely absurd. There are some men who I think do get very confused and distressed. There's no such thing as genuine gender dysphoria, otherwise middle-aged heterosexual women would have it, and they don't. But there are some men who get so distressed by the pornography use that they become very, very depressed. And I don't know, I couldn't say to you exactly what they think about what's happening inside themselves, because they, I think, are very, very, very messed up. But that's a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of what we're talking about here. And they are very badly served and have their bodies cut up and they're given terrible treatments by a medical profession which is out for profit. So we need to stop the whole thing dead. It's mainly created by the medical profession, who create the diagnoses and the treatments, and the men themselves are constructed by the pornography.
Yeah. And another participant asked if lesbian feminism always continued parallel to queer feminism, or if most women adopted queer feminism.
Now, in the 1990s, we saw queer starting to happen, because it was around 1990 that the language changed and some gay men started calling themselves queer. And queer always meant men, it never meant women, so lesbians became queer women because we were always a subcategory. And we knew it was very much against feminism because, of course, we never worked with gay men. In the 1980s, none of us were working with gay men. We had nothing to do with gay men. Lesbian feminism was a completely separate movement. As Bettina was talking about, we had lesbian strength marches, we had lesbian discos, lesbian plays, lesbian women's lesbian centers, and so on. Everything was simply lesbian. We had nothing to do with the men. Queer created a kind of force and pressure to try and get lesbians back into, in a way, under control. Queer theory was totally against lesbian feminism. It was incredibly hostile, particularly to lesbian ideas around sexuality. So no, I don't think that any of the lesbian feminists I ever knew joined into queer and worked with those gay men. There were some who did around AIDS, who were concerned about AIDS and about their gay brothers. And there were a few who in Britain worked to get rid of an Act of Parliament from 1988, which forbade the teaching of homosexuality in schools. Lesbians were important in doing that, and so they were working with gay men to do that. But really, I don't know any lesbians who, from my generation really, who joined into any of this. But queer quickly became predominant. Feminism was absolutely under threat. Queer went into the universities, postmodern and queer completely joined together, and created generations of young people who knew nothing about feminism, lesbian feminism, and so on. So no, we were never part of it, I would say. And what I fear happened in the 1990s, certainly by the end of the 1990s, is that a lot of lesbians had engaged in internal migration. There were no longer many things happening for lesbians, and they just tried to survive living their own lives. The lesbian feminists I'm talking about, they were definitely not involved in queer. But of course, the new generation trained up through the universities, the new generation of young lesbians is completely under the heel of queer.
Yeah. So do you have a last word to the women out there, the feminists out there, in order to encourage them?
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled that all of this is happening in Germany. I don't know if everybody knows, but I was born in Germany. I lived there for the first 3 years of my life. So I am absolutely thrilled that this is happening now in Germany, because German feminists have always been terrific and good and strong, as Leanne knows, who is listening to this. So it's terrific that the WHRC group is now there in Germany doing all of this. And look how far we've gone in Britain. And yes, it's going to happen. Okay, you will get there, definitely.
We hope so, with your help. Thank you.